Okay, going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Behind the Design series called Take a Seat, a Mexican Chair and Its Journey to Cooper Hewitt. I'm Matilda McQuaid, and I'm Acting Director of Curatorial, and so glad that you could be here this afternoon. So this, for those who this is your first time, welcome. This is a lunchtime discussion of about 45 minutes. And it's an opportunity for our conservators, our curators and educators and other specialists to come together for conversations around our collection and exhibitions. Our first one was about Willie Smith Day back in February. So we also encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and that will be moderated by Susie Swigert. So thank you very much, Susie. I just want to let you know we have our next program will be in May, on May 18th at 12:30. So just pencil that in, and we'll be sending you a link once we get it up on our website. And the next program will be called Watercolor Map Tiles, which is a very recent born digital acquisition. So Andrea Lips and some other panelists will be discussing that. So I also want to give a big shout out to Phoebe Moore, who works with curatorial and education, who has been incredible about organizing these events. So thank you, Phoebe, very, very much. So today you're going to hear from Yao-Fen Yu, who's head of product design and decorative arts and also acting deputy curatorial director, whose specialty is European decorative arts. Cristina De Leon, who's the associate curator of Latino design and who focused on design and decorative arts from the Americas in her studies. And then last but not least, Sarah Barrick, who's our head of conservation and senior objects conservator, whose recent research includes a technical study of 18th century British porcelain and technical imagery of historic glass. So we have lots of expertise behind today's discussion. So enjoy it, and please, again, put your questions in the chat during and afterwards. Okay, Yao-Fen, over to you.
Thank you, Matilda. Hello, everyone. So great to have you here today. So with this installment of Behind the Design, we thought we'd take you behind the scenes of a really important acquisition we made in 2019 of an extraordinary armchair made in the 18th century in modern day Mexico, which was then part of the Spanish Americas. So let's get to that slide, Phoebe, if you don't mind. Great, so here is the object in question in all its splendor. So, you know, people often want to know how museums acquire objects for the collection and what that process is. So, you know, we add to our collection in many ways. We sometimes they come as gifts, including bequests, or as purchases. And sometimes as curators, we actively hunt for objects, you know, on our wish list, either by attending fairs, going to galleries, talking to dealers. We also try to keep an eye out for objects that come up at auction. But sometimes you strike gold when you least expect it. And that was the case of this chair. So back in, I think, April 2019, Christina, who is now what we call an ABD candidate, all but dissertation, she was studying for her orals. She was really back in April 2019, I think she was really spending all her spare time studying and studying and studying on top of her job. And she was sort of like really, you know, sort of in a moment there. And I remember one day she came in, you know, on a Monday, it was just like, she was super excited. She was sort of like, just sort of couldn't contain herself because, she, you know, while studying, she had gone down this rabbit hole and came across, next slide, please, Phoebe, came across this chair on First Dibs. And she was just like, it was so passionate, so excited. And she was like, I can't believe this. There's this chair, it's available. Like, can we, like, I think we have to acquire it. And I was like, okay. And I was like, so I'm like, where is the chair? Right, because this is sort of, she said it was in Kensington, Maryland. And I was like, oh, I said, it's doable. I think we can go down there. And so I said, well, you know, with furniture is something, it's really notorious in terms of you never want to trust what you see in an image at all. I mean, same goes for everything, paintings, prints, works on paper, sculpture, but furniture is something that it's sort of, you really, really want to go see in person. So, we talked to Sarah, and we're very lucky at Cooper Hewitt to have a conservator, to have conservation staff, and to even have these conservation departments. We have conservation to support every department, every curatorial department at the museum. We have 4 in total. We have wall coverings, we have product design, decorative arts, textiles, and then drawings, prints, and graphic design. And for these 4 areas, we have 3 object labs. We have textiles, objects, and works on paper. And I've been very fortunate to work in museums that have conservation labs. And so it's always been part of my practice to work with conservators on acquisitions from the very beginning. So we talked to Sarah, and then Sarah said, yes, let's do it. Let's go down there. I think she's like, we can do it in a day. And, this was in April. We were thinking about going down in May. And I was also might have been thinking about crab cakes. It's like, wow, May, it's great crab season. I'm like, let's we just have to go. So, and so we sort of land on a date, and we get in the car, and then we went down in person. And as you'll see, so once you look closely, you see what happens when we go from this slide to the next slide. Phoebe, you'll see that what you see in person is quite different than what was shown on the website. And so here we're down there, and you'll see Christina and Sarah sort of behind, like right there on that picture, an image on your right. But anyway, you see that what we did, the first thing that we did was that we took off the chair. And so, and the reason you want to do this is because furniture is something, because it was used for because it often was used, was kept in, sometimes in damp houses, and housing that did not have climate control or air conditioning. You always want to kind of understand what you're getting. And you also want to understand what has happened to the chair or the piece of furniture over time. We have to keep in mind that wood is an organic material, subject to a lot of shrinking and contraction. And so this was what we did was that we went down there and we sort of, examined it from all sides. We wanted to examine every nook and cranny, and we wanted to understand. We wanted to really make sure that the chair was what it purported to be, and that the fact that it was from the 18th century. So as you see that we took off the seat, and we were able to turn it from all different angles. And I was really just struck by the craftsmanship and just sort of by the wood. And you see here, this is, if you go to the next picture, please, next image, you'll see this sort of, this is this kind of close looking is what you want to do. And it's not something you can often do virtually. And so we, next slide, please. And you see here that, and what you see here is what you want to see. You don't want to see something that's pristine, especially when it's something that's from the 18th century. You expect to see wear and tear. You also expect some level of sort of refinishing, right? Again, as I mentioned, wood is an organic material. You want to, it's obviously very prone to insect damage. It's also prone to water damage. And so that you can expect a level of refinish. So in this case, in that image on the upper left, you'll see that there has been some slight revarnishing. And that is something that you would want to see. You wouldn't want it to look spanking new. So, and anyway, so I'm going to talk about this here, and I'm going to turn over to Christina, who is going to talk to you about the historical significance of this chair.
Thanks, Yaofen. Phoebe, if you wouldn't mind moving forward. Oh, that's another detail of the chair's leg. Here we go. Thank you. So I originally thought this chair would be a great candidate for a members program at Cooper Hewitt that happens about every 2 years or so, called Design Watch. Each curator presents an object they would like to have for the permanent collection, and members vote on one object they would like to support with their membership dues. It's a competition. The objects are put on display and each curator makes a pitch as to why their object is an important and exciting acquisition for the collection. When I found this object, I was ecstatic for a few reasons. First, the armchair clearly illustrates the influence of Englishman Thomas Chippendale's Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director, published in 1754, which championed Gothic, Chinese, and Rococo styles for the design of domestic furnishings. Artisans from across the Americas adapted these patterns to produce furniture that would suit local tastes. Next slide, please. I felt this example demonstrated the global circulation of Chippendale's furniture patterns, but more importantly, how this style evolved in the Americas independently from European origins. At the time, Cooper Hewitt didn't have any furniture inspired by Chippendale's director. And frankly, I love the fact that our first piece would have been made not in New York or Philadelphia, but in New Spain, the region we now refer to as Mexico. New Spain had developed into the commercial epicenter of the Spanish crown's colonial empire, becoming one of the most culturally diverse and cosmopolitan regions of the world. And in addition, the abundance of master craftspeople and luxury hardwoods, such as mahogany, primavera, and Spanish cedar, helped propel New Spain as a place for high quality furniture production. Next slide, please. In the 18th century, the Spanish colonial chair had many similarities to English models, but craftsmen in New Spain did combine a wide variety and array of design motifs in ways not traditionally done in Europe or in the United States, for that matter. And someone at the Design Watch event actually commented that the chair was wild and that Chippendale would be rolling in his grave if he saw this. And I said, or he would be jumping for joy, because Chippendale's director was meant to be used as a guide for design inspiration, not as a manual to produce direct copies. The master artisan who made this armchair used the director as a jumping off point, but imbued their own creativity and exuberance into this design. Next slide, please. Prior to European colonization, joinery was not practiced by indigenous craftspeople of the Americas. It was introduced by Europeans along with nails, iron tools, and serrated saws. In the 16th century, joinery was among the first trades to be established in the Americas, since joiners arrived in the region as part of the crew which maintained and repaired ships. These craftsmen formed the first colonists to settle in the Americas and quickly instituted workshops and guilds modeled on European standards. Skilled indigenous artisans learned the woodworking trade quickly and became essential in the success of this new business enterprise. And I think it's really important to note that we do not know who made this object or the laborers who harvested the raw materials so that this chair could be produced. The enslavement of indigenous and African people in New Spain had a direct impact on the production of luxury goods like this armchair. And so while we don't have all the answers, it's critical that we continue to remain aware of the larger social, cultural, and political context in which this chair was made. Next slide, please. This armchair also provides an insight into how the wealthy and elite employed the most talented artisans to lavishly furnish their homes. We're getting an insight into the top 1% of Spanish colonial society. It was likely part of a larger set that may have included a settee and numerous side chairs, but only 2 armchairs would have been produced. And as you see, the green upholstered seat, that is a modern reproduction that the dealers had put in place, but it would have likely had a much more luscious and luxurious textile upholstered to the seat, likely red, perhaps dyed with cochineal. And something interesting also to note is that despite the many laws referred to as pragmáticas in effect since the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella to limit excessive public and private displays of wealth, affluence was widely and flamboyantly exhibited in elite Spanish colonial society, and the home served as a perfect stage. Next slide, please. So I didn't win Design Watch that year. That honor went to my colleague, Julia Seaman, who presented a drawing by the Flemish artist Jordanus that was made in circa 1600. Nevertheless, we were still able to acquire the chair through our usual acquisition processes, which allows curators to present objects for the permanent collection 4 times a year. It also gave us a little bit more time to have our colleagues at other institutions look at this chair and get their opinions. I am not a Spanish colonial expert. I've done lots of research and reading, and I've learned so much from my colleagues in other institutions, but this really was such an exceptional example that we wanted to do everything possible to make sure that we were encountering what we thought we were. And Sarah Barrick, our conservator, had the great idea to use this time that we had before the next acquisitions meeting to do some technical analysis and have the chair x-rayed. So I'm going to give it over to Sarah now so she can talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Christina. Perfect. And I just want to say that I so enjoy working with my colleagues in the curatorial division. I always learn something when they talk about objects and the history of artisans and craftsmen who produce the objects in our collection. So I was just so happy to listen to my colleagues this morning. I guess it's midday, wherever you are. Anyway, so indeed, we had extra time to really do a nice technical study. And what I mean when I say technical study is conservators are tasked with the preservation of the collection, and part of preserving a collection means understanding how materials were used, what materials we have, so identification, as well as manufacturing techniques that are inherent to the production of the object. We use all different means to discover these facts about the objects, and of course our eyes being the most important and close looking, as my colleague Yao Fen mentioned. But indeed, we also sometimes get to use fancier equipment, which is always quite a joy, and we learn quite a lot. So I have to express my gratitude to the Conservation Center, the Graduate School in Conservation at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, who allowed us, along with the help of a current student at the time, Andy Wolf, to perform X-radiography on this chair. And I'm going to show you some images of what we found out when we X-rayed the chair. Hopefully that'll give everybody a little bit of an insight into how we study objects. And much like a doctor might X-ray your arm if he thinks something is broken, X-radiography can be a wonderful tool to discover construction techniques on collections that we can't necessarily discern by the naked eye. And here we have a close-up of, or at least a feature of the backsplat on the chair that you've already seen. And I'm just going to go ahead and point out some details. For instance, you can see where the join of the crest or the top of the detail, I guess there's a cursor, but I don't think, Phoebe, are you controlling the cursor? If so, perhaps you can, and the cursor can, there we go, there's the join. You can kind of see a line that makes this sort of angle up and across, and you can see where the chair joins. And then there's that bright white detail there that Phoebe's circling. And that indicates some additional material, which is more radio opaque or dense than the surrounding wood, which could be some kind of restoration. Next slide, please. A piece of furniture. A mortise is the negative space that would have been cut, like chiseled or drilled out, and the tenon slots into it like this. And oftentimes you also might have like a little dowel put through to hold those pieces in place. But, and I think you can probably see the tenon and the arrow on the right, you can see sort of air or a space where we have a join there. Thank you, Phoebe, very helpfully pointing that out. Wonderful. So I think we can move on. And then at the top, you see the very tip of the crust was probably a replacement, or it's not as obvious in this reproduction in this picture, but we noticed during our visual examination, as well as the X-radiograph, that there was a slightly different kind of wood. The density of the wood was a little bit different. So there was probably at some point a repair made, which again, as Yao-Fen talked about, when you go and you see an object, and Christina mentioned as well, in person, we understand that objects have lives. They've been used. This was a functional piece. We would expect to see wear and tear and some sort of replacement on a piece that would have, held such an importance in terms of a decorative object. So indeed, this is not surprising, and often we expect this. And then I've just circled down to the lower right, that area of more radio opaque or dense material. We didn't do any analysis to determine what it was, but it's something to note in an X-ray. Next slide, please. Great. And so here's another area where we can see a mortise and a tenon slotted into the mortise. And indeed, you can also see that at the tip of the mortise, or the negative space, there are some weird little profiles. So it looks to me like likely a spade or flat drill bit was used to center the mortise. And it's a drill bit that kind of looks like this, like right angles, and then a little tip that would have been fed into the material. Because this is colonial, and as we talked about, 18th century, certain modern drill bits were not available at the time. So the twist drill bit that you might be most familiar with, if you're just sort of drilling into your wall or drilling to hang a hook, wasn't invented until the mid-19th century. And then after 1860, I think that was when the patent was developed or established, became more common. So at this point in time, we're dealing with different technologies. And when we X-radiograph objects, we're looking for evidence that this piece indeed was made with techniques or technologies consistent with the purported date of the object. And we were pleased to see this evidence as we flip through the X-radiograph results of the chair. So Phoebe, if you want to forward on, I think we're almost done. And just another arrow pointing out the joint we just looked at. If there was a nail or any other hardware, we would have seen it in this X-radiograph. It would have been much more radio opaque or white. It would have been white. And the scrolls at the tip of the arm, you see, you're shooting through a thicker piece of wood, which is why it looks whiter. It's more opaque. But we learned quite a bit during this process, and indeed, I feel like it was very useful exercise. And that's really all I had to say. So I will just open it up. Oh, yes, thank you. The last slide. Again, more details. Thank you.
My goodness. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Christina. So I thought I'm back here to moderate the discussion and answer questions. And we already have two questions that have come in. First was about the sort of the design on the chair, which we didn't, the vegetal design, which we didn't talk about too much. But I think someone wanted to know if they were leaves. And I think that definitely, that yes, that you can expect some kind of acanthus work, leaf work. But Christina, did you want to expand on that in any way?
Yeah, it's a pretty complex design, actually, which I think is what makes it really interesting. There is vegetal designs, particularly in the legs. You see sort of leaves that are carved throughout. I think the backsplat has this like very beautiful design as well. That's much more geometric, almost sort of like this is not the right way to describe it, but almost like a Celtic type design. And then around the rim of the back of the chair, you also see these stylized sort of flower or plant-like designs as well.
Yeah, great. And then here is another question that this is, it's a really good question, and I kind of expected this, but it's regarding sort of the ethics or the protocol of doing technical examination of works of art before they, like, as part of the acquisition process. So, I think I'm going to jump in and respond to this question. This comes from Colin Fanning. And so, you know, something like an X-ray that is considered non-invasive analysis. And a non-invasive analysis is often something that most museums would do as part of the acquisition process, but that is something that we do clear with the dealers before undertaking that. So in this instance, we did request permission to do the X-rays, and it often, you know, in terms, you can other places where I've worked, we've also done something like XRF, which is I can never remember what it means, what it stands for, Sarah, but it's basically doing pigment analysis to make sure that the pigments are consistent with that time period.
Extra fluorescence.
Yes, exactly. So, so that was, so yes. And then, oh my goodness, so many questions coming in. There is a question from our former fellow, Nick Stagliano. It is about sort of about the users of this chair and the clients sort of a chair like this, and as well as part of that furniture set that, so maybe you could expand on sort of, and you spoke about this, but maybe we'll expand on ways in which it would have sort of been central to that Spanish American, you know, upper class home.
Yeah, I mean, this chair would have been in an area that would have been in a much more public facing space because it was meant to show off. You know, that's why you have part of the Spanish colonial home was sort of this division of this public space and the more private space. And in the more public facing areas of the home, you would have had furniture and other decorative objects that really showcased your wealth, your aesthetic. And so this chair would have been in an area where the owner would have been able to show off a bit and show that they were able to employ the best craftsmen, the best types of material to produce this type of furniture.
Great. Thank you for that one. And then so many more. So here's a great question about sort of, I think there's two about talking about the Chippendale, sort of the relationship of this chair to Chippendale, right? So that, you know, do we, and I'm combining two questions here in terms of, you know, maybe you can talk about the way in which this was a very expressive reception of Chippendale, right? And so it is, right? We didn't really talk about the way that the armchairs kind of, you know, how would I say that? Like they kind of open up, right? It's sort of like the kind of that Baroque exuberance, right? And maybe you can talk about what more would have made it, like what is coming from Chippendale, and then what exactly was, and we didn't really talk about this, like the use of Primavera or another hardwood, right? So how is it marrying these two traditions?
I guess I'll start off by saying that what I think is so fascinating about the type of objects and material that comes out of the colonial Spanish Americas is that we're talking about a region that wasn't really tied down by the European system of the guild and trade, where, you know, artisans are making a very specific type of object, and that there's a lot of rules and, you know, specifics around what you can make, how you make it, who can make what type of materials you're allowed to make. In the Spanish Americas, while some of that did translate, it was much looser. So I think, you know, I kind of describe it as sort of like a free-for-all where artisans were really able to experiment and combine materials and styles in ways that you didn't really see in Europe. And when you compare this type of chair to, let's say, a similar type that was made in further up north, New York or Philadelphia, they're much more conservative. The aesthetic is not as exuberant. And that's partly because the Spanish Americas was very much known for this Baroque and elaborate style that they took on for a really long time. I mean, this type of aesthetic really took hold of the region for a much longer period than it even was in style in Europe. And so you see you see a lot of that influenced in this chair. I say Thomas Chippendale was likely the most, the pattern book that most influenced this chair, but we don't know. The truth of the matter is that a lot of this type of pattern books and like materials were circulating all over the world, and a lot of that material was coming to the Americas, and artisans, painters, I mean, they were looking at prints, pattern books, all types of materials that were being produced in Europe and interpreting that for their own production. And we acquired this chair in 2019, and I think we were able to, this is with many acquisitions, you're in a time crunch and you're trying to bring together as much research and information that you can, but we have so much more to do, in regards to where this chair was made in Mexico, perhaps Mexico City, perhaps Puebla, which was a big furniture hub. There's a lot of unanswered questions that I am the first to say that we still need to work on.
Correct, exactly. And that, I think that, you bring us to an excellent point in the discussion about sort of next steps, right? And I think there are a lot of questions concerning like the wood, like what's the material, right? How do we know when the repairs were might have been made, and that, and I think this, maybe Sarah, you can jump in and talk about sort of the difficulties of wood analysis, right? And in terms of understanding more, which then brings us also to the question of provenance, as someone has asked as well.
Sure. Yeah. So wood identification is a whole area of specialty, and often it requires a sample. So I should say that conservators sometimes remove material from an object to study it, and that is called sampling. That's something that we approach with a lot of intention, that we have conversations with our curatorial colleagues. We take it very seriously to remove anything from an object. And when I say remove, I mean very, very small amount. So, I mean, depending on the type of analysis we're going to do, we might remove something from an object that's like, the tip of my pencil, although it has to be a little bit larger for wood analysis. So if you'd like to do analysis on an object to determine the wood, the best thing to do is to remove a small amount of material and do a study on using microscopy or a microscope. And I'm like looking this way because I'm looking at my microscope, which is off screen, but right next to me is one of the vital tools we have in our laboratory. And we look at the structure, the cellular structure of that piece of wood, and different kinds of wood, hardwood versus softwoods, have different features that indicate what kind of wood they are. You can determine some of that from X-ray radiography that can tell you the tightness of the grain, for instance, a fine grain or a larger grain type of wood. But I think for an object to really understand what you have, the best thing to do is to do wood identification through removal. And that's something that I do not have as one of my, well-honed skills. So I would rely on a colleague and probably send it to another laboratory. We're very lucky in the Smithsonian because we have a large laboratory in Washington, D.C. called the Museum Conservation Institute, where conservation scientists who are trained scientists to work with cultural heritage material work. And don't believe they have anybody who's a specialist in wood identification there, but they offer us conversations about how to move forward with that kind of study and who to contact if we decide to go down that route. So that's something that we've talked internally about doing. And as far as dating of repairs go that you mentioned also, Yao Fan, again, that's something that we would do some analysis. Sometimes if it's clearly a modern tool that made that tool mark, we're able to tell, like something that was machine made, post mid 19th century, which we would not expect to see on an 18th century piece of furniture. We might be able to identify with our eyes and close looking and x-radiography and whatnot. But we might also do analysis. For instance, if it's an opaque white material, there might be pigment in it that wouldn't have been commercially available until the 20th century, like a titanium white. So, we do different kinds of analysis to do identification of those materials. And it really just depends on what we're looking at. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's it. And then I think there was a question that came earlier that I didn't see, but the question came from Jessica in terms of whether or not the chair were we in danger of losing the chair while we were undertaking analysis? And Jessica, I can tell you, it was only a race against time in terms of the dealer actually really wanting us to make a decision very quickly, but because we did have a reserve on it, and that's something that you can do, you can, put a reserve, and that, dealers often know that museums work very, very slowly, sometimes at glacial paces. And so we were okay there. I mean, had we wanted to undertake that kind of more invasive analysis, right, to do that with ID, then definitely, I think there was no way the dealer would have had any patience with us. So I hope that answers your question. And I think that, maybe we can, Christina, maybe we can talk about sort of how this chair compares to the other examples that we know, right? So, maybe we can talk about, maybe we can go back to that one slide, which I forgot to talk about, where we noticed that the foot had been very evenly worn down, and how, in fact, when Jorge came to see it, that was a really good sign, right?
Yeah. I'll first start off with the fact that when I joined Cooper Hewitt almost 4 years ago now, the institution had never really focused on colonial furniture from the Americas. The founders of Cooper Hewitt, the Hewitt sisters, they collected a lot of great European examples of design and decorative arts and furniture, but they were not interested in the Americas, including, work produced in the United States. So we're really starting from scratch. And while my area of expertise, really begins in the late 19th century and goes to the present, I knew that in order for us to be able to tell a much fuller story about the history of design, we needed to begin to focus on colonial furniture and design and material culture from the Americas. It was an important task, I think, that the museum needed to take on. And that doesn't mean we're going to be the experts or have the most comprehensive collection, but it does mean that we can pinpoint, really exceptional examples that help tell important and multi-layered stories. And I think it also is a way for us to, we have a great relationship with Parsons New School of Design's curatorial program, as well as Bard Graduate Center and other universities in the region. And, this was a great object for study, not just within the curatorial realm, but within the field of students who are studying this material. With that said, we looked at a lot of examples, so many. At the time I had a Parsons Fellow, and she was dedicated, for a few months of scouring every single book and every single chair, similar example in museum collections and public collections that she could find. I mean, we looked at a lot. We also, called upon our colleagues who are experts in the field. One is Jorge Rivas, who is the curator of Spanish colonial art at the Denver Art Museum, who's a specialist in colonial furniture. And when he was in New York, we said, can you please come and take a look at this? Part of doing due diligence is also recognizing when you know something's really good, but you need to call someone who knows, you know, who definitely knows. And that's I feel like you should never feel sort of inadequate about not being the expert on certain things, because the important thing is that these important objects come into the collection and are available for the public. And while I could read 100 books about this material, you know, I'm still not going to be at the same level as some of my colleagues who have been studying this for their entire career. And I'm grateful for them that they're willing to take the time to look at it. So, you know, it takes a village. You know, acquisitions are not something that, you know, you say, oh, that's that, and I want to acquire that, I'm just going to buy it. Yao Fen is a specialist in the 18th century. She's done a lot of work on furniture construction. So obviously it was so important for her to come and look at this chair and say, like, yes, in my opinion, I think this all looks good, you know, on top of Sarah, our conservator. So, you know, when we're thinking about having these objects come into the collection, it's a pretty long conversation. This actually happened quicker than most. And by quicker, I mean, it took us about 6 months, but sometimes this could take a year. You know, it's not unlikely for an acquisition to take a year to actually come into the permanent collection. And, you know, sometimes we have a year and sometimes we don't. You know, in this instance, I think 6 months, you know, pretty much pushed it with the dealer, who was closing, by the way, like that gallery was closing. And so they were trying to, you know, come to terms with the stock that they had. And they knew this was an important chair and they wanted it to go to an institution, but, you know, they were also like, hey, can't take forever. So yes, looked up many, so many. There's still more to look at, I think.
Yes, and then so something that Jorge really loved when he saw this, and getting back to Christina's point about Cakes Village. So, you know, he was able to, for instance, when he saw how abraded, sort of that the way in which the foot had been braided very, very evenly, he said, oh, that's a really great sign, because it actually means that, you know, that's a good sign in terms of its integrity or the authenticity, because, you know, we know that the floors in the 18th century household, it was usually like a stone floor. And so this, you know, shows that it would have been scraping against sort of a hard surface. So he thought that was a really good sign. And also that, you know, someone who also has done a lot of archival research going into inventories. And so, and it is in these inventories that we have this understanding that the upholstery most likely was red, you know, perhaps from cochineal instead of green. And so that's, yes. And so this is what it is this kind of community of sort of community hive mind that we try to tap into. And it's important to have these dialogues with one another. And I think, I know we're coming to an end, I thought, and there is a great question about sort of kind of like the appeal of Spanish Baroque and, you know, Rococo exuberance in the Americas, especially in churches. And Philippe, that's unfortunately a question that would take, if we could really talk at length about that, but it's an excellent observation. So I do want to acknowledge that. But, you know, obviously there are political implications to this kind of exuberant style. And then, so I think there is I'm going to end by answering this question about where is this displayed in the museum? So as you know, the museum is closed for the moment, and we hope to reopen sometime in the summer. But once we are reopened, you can you can expect to see the chair on view in the middle of Gallery 203 as part of an exhibition I'm organizing, that I've organized, I guess I would say, that I have organized, called Foreign Exchange, 18th Century Design on the Move. And you will be able to see the chair sort of front and center in 203, along with 2 other British chairs made around the same time from our collection, that sort of will show the ways in which, you know, materials in print, especially printed materials like Chippendale's Director, circulated around the globe. And so that is something we can tell you. And then I think that there was a question. There's two questions left that we haven't really got to. One of them was a reading list, Christina, about good books on colonial Mexican design and furniture, and then which I believe that I'm sure we can send to the person other people's interested. Maybe we can have somewhere we can post online somewhere, maybe like sort of 5 top books. And then I think the last question was about the asymmetry, which I'm having a hard time moving my chat box here. The cartouche in the center of the seat rail is interestingly asymmetrical with an extra bunch of ivy-ish foliage on the left side. Even with this asymmetricality, is the cartouche centered on the seat rail? And I want to be able to answer that, Marianne, like off the top of my mind, but I feel like now I have to go back to the image of the chair to answer this question. And I think, there is one last question from Michael about the secondary wood, the wood in the slip seat. And it's true, we have not been, even Michael, with the wood itself, we are we know that many chairs from this time period are made from Primavera, but we do not know for sure. So we kind of are cautious and kind of say hardwood, and indicating that it could be Primavera. But no, we have not done the full wood analysis. And I think that it brings us to the end of our program then. So thank you all so much for being here. And before everyone leaves, we hope that we can encourage you to respond to the survey that we sent out either at the end of the program or shortly after. And we welcome you. We sort of will welcome or look forward to seeing you at the next Behind the Design, which I believe will be on sometime in April. Sorry, I do not have the date handy. Until then, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you at the next Behind the Design. Bye-bye.
Thank you.